Auguste Chateau died in 1829, but his widow lived on the house for many more years. It was torn down in 1841, despite pleas to save it, and the land was cleared for the first commercial enterprises that followed. It was the first of grand homes in St. Louis to meet such a fate, but it would not be the last. Chateau's name was lent to a number of streets, parks, and buildings in the community over the years. One such place was Chateau's Pond, which was formed in 1765 by flour mill owner Joseph Tallien. He created the pond by damming La Petite Rivière to provide power for his mill. Laclede later purchased that mill, and when he died, Chateau purchased it from Maxent. In 1770, he built a large mill and enlarged the pond. The pond became a city landmark and a favorite local spot for fishing, boating, and swimming. A boathouse was added to the property in 1821. Fireworks displays lit up the sky above the pond, and many religious services and baptisms occurred along its shore. The land was eventually passed on to Chateau's sons, Henry and Gabriel. Henry, Auguste's third child, was the clerk of the county court and later recorder of the St. Louis County. He married Clemence Coursault, and they had 10 children together. Henry built a grand home overlooking Chateau's Pond in 1830. The Greek Revival-style mansion stood at what is now the corner of Tucker Boulevard and Clark Street. Soon after it was completed, he left his county office and established a mercantile firm, Chateau and Riley, later Chateau and Val. He became one of the largest coffee and sugar merchants along the Mississippi and spent his winters at a plantation in the South. Henry died in 1855 in what became known as the Gascon River disaster. Henry was one of many prominent St. Louis citizens to be killed during the inaugural run of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It was meant to be a part of the Pacific Railroad, building west from St. Louis. The plan to make it was the starting point of the first transcontinental railroad, an effort led by Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Construction had started in 1851, and 2 years later it reached Kirkwood. By 1855, the line had been finished to Jefferson City, crossing the Gascon River on a 760-foot wooden span, which was unfinished. It was being supported by a temporary trestle. On November 1st, 1855, a day of heavy rains, the first train left downtown St. Louis carrying about 600 invited visitors, including Henry. Thomas O'Sullivan was the chief engineer on the train. He considered stopping to check on the Gascon River Bridge before crossing it, but the train was behind schedule and he opted not to stop. Besides, a gravel hauling train had crossed it on the previous day, so he was sure it was fine. However, as the train started to pass over the bridge, the span between the east bank and the first pier collapsed. The steam engine and 7 of the cars fell through the wooden timbers, while others rolled down the 36-foot embankment to the river below. Only 1 car remained on the tracks. When the smoke cleared, 31 people were dead, including Henry Chateau, E. Church Blackman, president of the city council, industrialist Calvin Case, attorney Man Butler, well-known clergyman Artemus Bullard, and John Teasdale, and many others. Washington King, the St. Louis mayor, was also on the train, but survived. There were 70 other people who were seriously injured. Minutes after the disaster, a conductor tried to telegraph for help from the nearby Herman, but the storm had disabled the lines, and word of the accident did not reach St. Louis until 7 hours after the bridge's collapse. A hospital train was dispatched to the scene. Survivors helped load the dead on a freight car. On the way back to the city, the hospital train was stopped by floodwaters at Boeuf Creek. Fearing the bridge would collapse, survivors walked across the bridge on foot and boarded a second train on the other side. Engineers pushed the cars of the hospital train over the bridge one at a time, by hand. In the midst of this, the bridge collapsed and another train was pitched into the water. The second train also had to be abandoned because of the rising waters, and the wounded and the dead had to be transported to Washington by steamboat. They did not reach St. Louis until November 3rd. A Missouri Pacific train finally made it to Jefferson City 4 months later, but the Gascon River disaster jinxed St. Louis's chances at becoming the starting point of the Transcontinental Railroad. After Henry's death, the magnificent Chateau mansion was torn down, and its location became the site of the Four Courts building. It was completed in 1871 and housed St. Louis's 4 municipal courts, police department, jail, and as you'll see later in this chapter, at least 1 or 2 ghosts. As a side note, it should be mentioned that, despite its appearances on scores of maps, Chateau's Pond died before its namesake's son. It only lasted until 1852. A few years later, George Collier had located the Collier White Lead Company on the shore of the pond. His business was followed by a slaughterhouse, and combined, they slowly began to destroy the natural environments of the pond. There were no zoning regulations or pollution laws in those days, and they used the pond as an open sewer. Some blame the cholera epidemic that ravaged the city in 1849 on the conditions of Chateau's Pond. The public demanded that it to be cleaned up, and it was drained in 1852. The pond site was soon occupied by vast railroad yards and became just another lost St. Louis memory.